The clock is ticking on the world's most powerful currency, and the countdown has already begun. Right now, in 2025, the United States dollar is displaying every warning sign that has preceded the collapse of dominant currencies throughout history. Not gradual decline, not slow erosion, but sudden catastrophic failure that reshapes entire civilizations overnight. There's a pattern buried in monetary history that most people never see coming. It's a 5-stage sequence that has played out repeatedly across centuries, destroying the financial foundations of empires and wiping out the wealth of millions who believed their money was safe. The Roman denarius, the Spanish real, the German mark, the British pound sterling. Each followed this exact same progression from dominance to disaster. And here's what should terrify every American holding dollars right now. The United States has already completed 3 of the 5 stages. We're not approaching the danger zone, we're deep inside it. This is the story of how reserve currencies die, why they always think they're immune to history, and why the mathematical certainty says the dollar is next. Before we examine the 5 stages, you need to understand what currency collapse actually means in practice. It's not theoretical, it's not gradual. When a reserve currency fails, it happens with shocking speed and devastating consequences. In November 1923, a single US dollar could buy 1 trillion German marks. Citizens needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread. Pensioners starved as their life savings became worthless paper. Social order collapsed as people realized their government had destroyed their money. That wasn't ancient history. That was less than a century ago, in one of the world's most advanced economies. The German people didn't see it coming because the collapse felt impossible right up until it happened. Sound familiar? Let me show you the 5-stage pattern and where America stands right now. Stage 1 is fiscal overextension. This happens when government spending permanently exceeds the economy's ability to support it. Not during wartime or crisis, but as normal operating procedure. The government makes promises it cannot mathematically keep, accumulates debt faster than economic growth, and begins consuming resources that should be building future prosperity. The United States crossed this threshold decades ago, but the acceleration has become breathtaking. On October 23, 2025, the national debt reached $38 trillion. That's a new record, achieved just months after the previous record. The debt is growing at the fastest pace of any developed nation, adding trillions annually even during periods of economic expansion. But the raw number isn't the real problem. The killer is what happens when debt service consumes everything else. In fiscal year 2025, the federal government spent $970 billion just on interest payments. That's 19% of all federal revenue, the equivalent of $7,300 per household. Not for roads, schools, defense, or social programs, just interest on previous borrowing. The Congressional Budget Office projects these payments will grow 76% over the next decade, reaching $1.8 trillion by 2035. That means nearly 30% of all government revenue will go to creditors, not citizens. When interest payments consume that much of a government's resources, history shows what happens next. Default, hyperinflation, or both. Stage 2 is monetary debasement. When governments can't pay their bills through taxation or borrowing, they turn to the printing press. They create new money to cover obligations, diluting the value of existing currency. This feels like a solution because it avoids immediate political pain, but it's actually a hidden tax on everyone holding that currency. The Federal Reserve has been executing Stage 2 with unprecedented aggression. The money supply has increased 400% since 2000. Since 2020 alone, over $6 trillion have been created from nothing. The dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1971, when President Nixon severed the last connection to gold. But 2025 has revealed the Fed's impossible position. They're cutting interest rates to support a weakening labor market while inflation remains above target. The dollar index fell 11% in the first half of 2025, its biggest loss since 1973. When central banks must choose between supporting domestic growth and maintaining currency strength, the currency always loses, every time in history. Stage 3 is international confidence erosion. This is when other countries begin hedging against the dominant currency. They diversify reserves, create alternative payment systems, and start conducting trade in other currencies. It begins quietly, accelerates gradually, then reaches a tipping point where confidence evaporates rapidly. The signs are everywhere. Central banks added over 1,000 metric tons of gold to their reserves in 2024, the third consecutive year of massive accumulation. Poland alone bought 90 tons. These aren't normal diversification moves. These are preparations for dollar instability. The BRICS nations have expanded from 5 to 9 countries, representing nearly half the world's population. They're building alternative financial infrastructure designed to bypass dollar-dominated systems. China's cross-border interbank payment system now connects 4,800 banks across 185 countries. This isn't theoretical competition. This is operational replacement of dollar-based infrastructure. Even more telling, foreign ownership of U.S. Treasury bonds has fallen consistently over 15 years. Countries that once competed to hold dollars are actively reducing their exposure. When your creditors start demanding alternatives, your currency is in stage 3. The weaponization of the dollar through sanctions has accelerated this process dramatically. When Russia was removed from SWIFT, every country watching realized their dollar reserves could be frozen or seized for political reasons. President Trump's threat of 150% tariffs on BRICS nations for pursuing de-dollarization has only strengthened their resolve. Brazil's president responded that BRICS is committed to ending dollar dominance no matter what. This confrontational approach is backfiring spectacularly. Instead of deterring alternatives, it's proving exactly why countries need them. When your reserve currency becomes a weapon, other nations will build shields. Stage 4 is institutional breakdown. This happens when the systems that support currency confidence begin failing. Banks become unstable, government credibility erodes, and social cohesion fractures. People lose faith not just in the money, but in the institutions that issue it. American regional banks are already showing cracks. Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic all failed in 2023. New York Community Bank nearly collapsed in 2024. These failures happened during economic expansion, not recession. The underlying problem is commercial real estate exposure, combined with interest rate risk. Over $2 trillion in commercial mortgages mature during 2025 and 2026. Office buildings sit 40 to 50% vacant due to permanent remote work changes. Properties financed at 3% interest rates can't generate enough income to service debt at 8% rates. When these mortgages can't be refinanced, defaults will cascade through the regional banking system. But the institutional breakdown goes beyond banking. Political dysfunction has reached paralysis. Trust in government institutions sits at historic lows. The country can't agree on basic facts, let alone solutions to massive fiscal and monetary problems. When societies fracture this severely, currencies typically follow. Stage 5 is systemic collapse. This is when mathematical reality overwhelms political promises. The government can no longer service debt, the currency loses international acceptance, and hyperinflation destroys domestic purchasing power. It happens quickly, usually triggered by a specific event that reveals the underlying insolvency. We haven't reached stage 5 yet, but stages 1 through 4 are complete or accelerating. The trajectory is clear, and history suggests the timeline is shorter than most people imagine. Currency collapses don't announce themselves. They arrive suddenly, catching populations unprepared. The Weimar Republic thought it could manage inflation gradually. The British Empire believed the pound's reserve status was permanent. The Soviet Union assumed its superpower status guaranteed monetary stability. They were all wrong, and the mathematical certainty that destroyed them is building again. The United States dollar is running out of time because mathematics doesn't care about American exceptionalism. When debt service consumes 30% of revenue, when the money supply grows faster than the economy, when creditors build alternative systems, the pattern completes itself regardless of political will or economic theory. The pattern reveals itself through specific mechanisms that most Americans don't understand. When reserve currencies collapse, they don't simply fade away gradually. They experience what economists call a currency death spiral, where each stage accelerates the next until the entire system implodes within months or even weeks. Here's how it actually unfolds. First comes the recognition phase. International markets realize the reserve currency is mathematically unsustainable. This recognition spreads quietly through central banks, sovereign wealth funds, and major institutional investors. They begin reducing exposure without announcing it publicly. Foreign governments start negotiating trade agreements in alternative currencies. Oil producers accept payments in yuan or gold instead of dollars. This phase is invisible to ordinary citizens because the effects haven't reached consumer prices yet. The dollar still works for daily transactions. Americans can still buy groceries, pay rent, and fill their gas tanks without noticing anything unusual. But beneath the surface, the foundation is cracking. Then comes the acceleration phase. As international demand for dollars decreases, those dollars start flowing back to the United States. This creates what's called a currency repatriation crisis. Suddenly, there are too many dollars chasing too few goods in the American economy. Inflation explodes not gradually, but exponentially. The Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice. They can raise interest rates aggressively to defend the dollar, which crashes the economy and makes government debt service impossible. Or they can keep rates low to support domestic activity, which accelerates dollar devaluation and makes inflation worse. There's no middle ground. Every historical example shows central banks choose the second option because political pressure forces them to prioritize short-term domestic stability over long-term currency strength. The velocity of money increases dramatically during this phase. When people realize their currency is losing value rapidly, they spend it as quickly as possible. This creates a feedback loop where increased spending drives higher prices, which makes people spend even faster, which drives prices higher still. The German hyperinflation followed exactly this pattern. Citizens learned that money held overnight lost value, so they rushed to convert it into real goods immediately. Next comes the panic phase. This is when currency collapse becomes visible to ordinary people. Grocery prices double monthly, gas stations change prices daily, import costs skyrocket because foreign suppliers demand payment in stable currencies or gold. The government responds by printing even more money to cover its obligations, which makes everything worse. Social cohesion breaks down rapidly during this phase. People who followed the rules, saved money and planned for retirement, watched their life savings evaporate. Meanwhile, those with debt denominated in the collapsing currency see their obligations become meaningless. A mortgage that required 30 years to repay can suddenly be satisfied with pocket change. This creates massive wealth redistribution that destroys middle-class stability. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. When people lose faith in their money, they lose faith in their government, their institutions, and their society. Crime increases as economic desperation spreads. Political extremism flourishes as people seek radical solutions to desperate circumstances. The social contract that holds civilization together begins to fray. Finally comes the reset phase. The old currency becomes worthless, and a new monetary system emerges. Sometimes governments issue new currency backed by gold or foreign reserves. Sometimes they adopt another country's currency entirely. Sometimes they implement currency controls and rationing systems. The specific mechanism varies, but the result is always the same. The old money dies, and people who held it lose everything. The timeline for this complete sequence has shortened dramatically in the modern era. The German hyperinflation took 3 years from start to finish. The Soviet ruble collapsed in 18 months. The Venezuelan bolivar lost 90% of its value in 2 years. Modern financial markets move faster than historical precedents, which means future currency collapses will likely be even more rapid and severe. The United States dollar faces additional vulnerabilities that make its potential collapse more dangerous than previous examples. Unlike the German mark or British pound, the dollar serves as the world's primary reserve currency. When it fails, there's no larger, more stable currency to provide a safety net. The entire global financial system is built around dollar dominance. Its collapse would create worldwide economic chaos unlike anything in recorded history. International derivative markets total over $600 trillion in notional value, almost all denominated in dollars. Currency swaps, interest rate agreements, and commodity contracts all assume dollar stability. When that assumption proves false, counterparty failures could cascade through every major financial institution on Earth. The 2008 financial crisis would look like a minor disruption compared to a dollar collapse scenario. The interconnectedness of modern banking amplifies these risks exponentially. Regional American banks hold trillions in commercial real estate loans that become worthless when the dollar collapses and property values crash. European banks hold massive dollar-denominated assets that evaporate overnight. Asian exporters who accumulated dollars as payment for goods find their reserves transformed into worthless paper. Central banks worldwide would face simultaneous crises as their dollar reserves lose value while their domestic currencies experience either hyperinflation or deflationary collapse, depending on their economic structure. Countries heavily dependent on dollar-denominated debt would default en masse, creating a global sovereign debt crisis that makes previous emerging market crises look trivial. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond economics. American military power depends fundamentally on dollar dominance. The ability to fund massive defense spending without immediate economic consequences relies on other countries accepting dollars for real goods and services. When that arrangement ends, America's global military presence becomes financially impossible to maintain. Allies who have relied on American security guarantees would suddenly find themselves exposed, forced to dramatically increase their own defense spending or seek alternative protection arrangements. The NATO alliance could fracture as European nations realize America can no longer afford to subsidize their security. Asian partners might align with China rather than an economically crippled United States. The domestic political consequences would be equally severe. American politicians have promised benefits and services that depend entirely on the dollar's reserve currency status. Social Security, Medicare, defense spending, and debt service consume the vast majority of federal revenue. When the dollar collapses, funding these obligations becomes impossible without hyperinflation that destroys their real value anyway. The American political system is not designed to handle this kind of crisis. Unlike parliamentary systems that can change governments quickly, the American system creates gridlock during emergencies. Congress would struggle to pass emergency legislation, while states might declare independence from federal authority if Washington can't provide basic services. The constitutional framework assumes a functioning currency and credit system that may no longer exist. This is why understanding the five-stage pattern matters so urgently. We're not discussing theoretical possibilities or distant future scenarios. The United States is currently in stage 4 of a 5-stage collapse sequence that has played out repeatedly throughout monetary history. The mathematical pressures are building toward stage 5, and when it arrives, most Americans will be completely unprepared for what follows. The window for preparation is closing rapidly. When stage 5 begins, it will be too late to protect yourself or your family from the consequences. The signs are visible right now for those who know how to read them. The pattern is clear for those who understand history, and the timeline is shorter than almost anyone realizes. The preparation phase is where individuals and institutions can still take action, but this window is measured in months, not years. History shows that when stage 5 arrives, protective measures become impossible to implement. Banks freeze accounts, governments impose capital controls, and normal financial markets cease to function. The time to act is now, while the system still operates predictably. Smart money has already begun positioning for what's coming. Warren Buffett sits on over $300 billion in cash, the largest capital position in his career. Corporate insiders are selling at levels not seen since 2007. Foreign central banks continue accumulating gold at unprecedented rates while reducing Treasury holdings. These aren't random market movements. These are calculated preparations by people who understand the mathematical inevitability of what's approaching. The mechanisms of protection require understanding how currency collapse actually affects different asset classes. Cash becomes worthless, but not immediately. There's usually a period where domestic prices haven't fully adjusted to international devaluation. This creates opportunities for those prepared to act quickly. Real assets maintain value because they represent actual productive capacity rather than monetary claims. Physical commodities, productive real estate, and essential businesses continue generating value regardless of currency instability. Agricultural land produces food, energy infrastructure provides power, and manufacturing facilities create goods that people need. These assets don't depend on monetary stability for their underlying worth. During the German hyperinflation, farmers who owned land survived, while pensioners holding marks starved. But protection goes beyond asset allocation. Geographic diversification becomes critical when dealing with reserve currency collapse. The dollar's failure would devastate the American economy more severely than any other nation because Americans have no experience with currency instability. Countries that have weathered multiple devaluations develop institutional knowledge and social resilience that America lacks. International banking relationships, foreign real estate holdings, and citizenship or residency rights in stable countries provide options when domestic systems fail. Switzerland, Singapore, and other nations with strong institutions and conservative monetary policies offer refuges that may preserve wealth through the transition period. This isn't about abandoning America, but about ensuring survival when American institutions temporarily cease functioning. The social preparation aspect cannot be ignored. Currency collapse destroys trust between citizens and creates conditions where normal social cooperation breaks down. Communities with strong relationships and mutual support systems weather crises better than atomized populations dependent on government services. Rural areas with agricultural capacity and local production prove more resilient than urban centers relying on complex supply chains. Skills and knowledge become more valuable than financial assets when monetary systems collapse. Medical training, engineering expertise, agricultural knowledge, and practical trades generate value regardless of currency instability. People who can produce essential goods and services maintain their standard of living, while those dependent on financial investments watch their wealth evaporate. The psychological preparation may be the most important element. Americans have never experienced serious currency devaluation. The closest historical parallel was the Civil War greenback inflation, but that affected a much smaller, more agricultural economy. Modern Americans have no institutional memory of monetary chaos, which makes them psychologically unprepared for what's coming. Understanding that currency collapse is a process, not an event, helps maintain perspective during the crisis. The panic phase creates opportunities for those with prepared mindsets and available resources. Distressed assets become available at fraction of normal prices. Desperate sellers accept terms they would never consider during stable periods. Wealth preservation becomes wealth accumulation for those positioned correctly. The timeline indicators suggest 2026 through 2028 represent the highest probability window for Stage 5 completion. Commercial real estate defaults will cascade through the banking system during this period. Government debt service will consume unsustainable portions of federal revenue. International alternatives to dollar-based trade will reach critical mass. The mathematical pressures will overwhelm political ability to manage them. Specific trigger events could accelerate this timeline dramatically. A major bank failure, a Treasury auction that fails to attract sufficient buyers, a geopolitical crisis that forces rapid military spending, or a natural disaster requiring massive federal response could push the system into Stage 5 within months rather than years. The underlying instability means any significant shock could initiate the final collapse sequence. The 5-stage collapse pattern doesn't lie, and mathematics doesn't negotiate. America stands at Stage 4 with Stage 5 approaching faster than anyone wants to admit. The signs are visible, the timeline is shortening, and the window for preparation is closing. When the dollar's time runs out, only those who understood the pattern and acted accordingly will survive what comes next.